Welcome to STEM Stories with Mr. Ewing. Today, we're going to look up into the sky and see what secrets does the sky hold for us. You know, as much as I love to think about all the amazing things that happen here on Earth, I'm always fascinated with the stuff that actually happens up in our sky. Way beyond the horizon line of our Earth, up in that vast mystery of the rest of the universe, or what we call up in the sky. Let's talk about number one, the sun. You know, that big giant ball of light that's up in the sky. Well, it's actually not a big bright light. I mean, it is light and it is hot, but it's a star. It's not one of our planets. And a lot of people do confuse it with that. But it is a giant, massive star that provides us with all the light and heat that allow us to actually live on Earth. And one of the most beautiful things that we get to see every day, well, weather permitting, is the sunrise and a sunset. But that's a huge myth because the sun doesn't actually move. The Earth is actually moving, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Way back a long time ago, people used to think that Earth was the center of our universe, and the sun was 3 or 4 planets away from Earth, that everything revolved around Earth. Now, in theory, that sounds like a great idea because that puts us number one. But over time, we soon realized, and as we educated and got stronger and powerful tools and really started figuring out what was going on in the universe, that we realized that the sun is actually the center of our universe, and we're 3 planets out. Now, that brings us to a really important piece. Now, if you look at our sketch here, the planets are orbiting around the sun. The sun actually isn't moving. Well, it's not moving around us. So if the sunrise and sunset was actually the sun moving, then in theory that would be true. But it's because the Earth is actually orbiting around the sun and rotating on its axis that makes it appear that our sun rises in the east and sets in the west. Now, to kind of give us an idea of what that actually looks like, here's a model, and we can pretend this is our sun and this is our Earth, and the Earth is actually moving around the sun. That gives us the illusion of a sunrise and sunset. But it's still spectacular when you get to see them. It's one of my favorite things. But we have to remember that it is the Earth orbiting around the sun, and then this Earth also moves in another rotation. It's a lot of confusion going on, but it's easy if you think about it this way. The sun doesn't move, and planets, the Earth included, move around in a circle, technically a circle, around the sun. That's called an orbit. The rotation comes when the Earth, and I know it's spelled backwards, is actually what's on an imaginary axis, and our Earth rotates like that as it orbits around the sun. So it does 2 different rotations in theory. One's called a rotation, one's called an orbit. The rotation's on its imaginary axis, and then it orbits around the sun. So the rotation is what gives us our night and day around the sun, and the sunrise and sunsets. The orbit is actually what controls our year's length and our seasons. That brings us to our moon. Now, the moon kind of does the same thing that the Earth does with the sun. The Earth stands still, or actually while it's orbiting around the sun, the moon is then orbiting around Earth. And that's why we see the moon up in the sky sometimes, and other times of the day we don't. Now, back a long time ago, people actually believed a lot of different things about the moon before we had actually gotten there in 1968. Some people believed there was a man in the moon. You'll still hear people talk about man in the moon. Some people actually believed that the moon was made of cheese. It's not. The moon is a solid rock, just like a lot of the other planets. But it does the same thing that Earth does with the sun. The moon rotates around our Earth. Now, that brings us to another really important thing that happens up in our skies. The moon and its orbits around the Earth changes phases. And we have all different phases of the moon as it cycles through in a certain amount of period of time. And it gives us all these different shapes. Some of them even actually have really cool names. There's the harvest moon, the one I love, the blood moon. And then you've got the Farmer's Almanac that has all these crazy kooky names like the wolf moon, the strawberry moon, a lot of different names for our moons. But all in all, it's just the moon. And no matter what it looks like up in the sky and all its different shapes and colors, it doesn't change. It's just its position in our atmosphere, in the orbit, and in our atmosphere, the dust and everything will change the way it looks. And it's actually, the size of it will appear to be larger because it's actually closer to the Earth at different times of the year. But it never changes shape and it never changes color. And that brings me to one of my favorite things to look at. And I can spend days and days looking up in the sky. But up in our sky, we have an uncountable number of stars. The cool thing about a star is actually that star is already burned out by the time we see it come into Earth's sky. Now, we can look up at the sky all day and all night and see some really, really amazing stuff. And astronomers, people that study stars, over the years and centuries, actually started naming some of the patterns and naming some of the stars based on our zodiac signs, based on mythology, Greek mythology. There's all different ways they've been named, and different cultures have different names for them too. Like one of my favorite, which I'll talk to you about in a second, considered the Big Dipper. Depending on the culture that you were raised in, some people believe that it is a big giant scoop or a ladle. It also has the name of a big bear, and other cultures have different descriptions of them, and those different constellations actually correspond with other constellations, and there's all kinds of stories and everything. That's a whole nother lesson that if you want to dig into, there's some pretty amazing stories based on constellations. Now, I want to tell you a little story about my growing up and why I love stars so much. When I used to, as a kid, go visit my grandfather, we would go in the backyard of his house, and it was out in the middle of the country in Connecticut, and you could see all the stars at night, especially in the summer. And one of my favorite things to do is have my grandfather would point out all the different constellations. Now, the one over here that I'm showing you is one that's called the Big Dipper. Now, it may be hard to see at first, but if you look for this little pattern, the 4 stars and then the 2 that come down from it, that's what's considered the Big Dipper. It's also referred to as the Big Bear. Now, to help us see it, I kind of rotated it to the side, and this is why some people kind of look at it as the Big Ladle. And it just always was cool to me, and one of my favorite things to do with my grandfather was to go find that set of stars, those constellations up in the sky. So I hope you get an opportunity to get out, look at the different moons, look at the different stars, and start to realize that there's a whole lot of stuff out there in the universe for us to explore and to learn about. The Earth, the sun, the stars, the moon, that's just a small little piece of it. So go out and look up in the sky.